is a major part of our course as we examine various manifestations of Western art and see what values we can find expressed in that art. Tillich, when he would finish a long day at the university, teaching, writing, doing research, he would come home and sit back and listen to some classical music. But he never wrote about music when it came to fairly high art. Instead, he focused on visual art, on painting and architecture. And he spoke and wrote a lot about that. So it's good that in our anthology, Theology of Culture, we do have one chapter that is all about art. It's entitled Protestantism and Artistic Style, which is kind of a strange title, but eventually we'll get to why he chose that title. But let's look at some of the most important points, I think the central points of the chapter, and we'll call our talk today, Tillich and Art. Early in this chapter, Tillich mentions that there are really three components to an artistic creation, not just visual art, but any form of art. Number one is the subject matter or the content. Now, when it comes to a painting, that would be obvious enough. It's a still life of an apple in a vase with flowers, or it's a picture of Jesus on the cross. So the subject matter or the content. The next component he identifies is the form. In the case of art, that would be paint. It's really the medium or media. In music, it would be notes that have a certain pitch, a certain tonal quality. Finally, last but not least, is style. As you'll remember, when we talked about chapter 4, style is very, very important for Tillich because the style of an artistic creation expresses, reveals the ultimate concern, the deepest values of an individual and his or her culture. As Tillich puts it in this chapter, there will be commonalities in the art of a particular period because the concerns of that period would be held in common by all the artists. So we have commonalities in a particular age. And again, those always, according to Tillich at least, and this is a pretty bold claim, these always express the ultimate concern or concerns of that period. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about 4 types of style, really. Tillich calls them 4 keys. He's borrowing from a German philosopher, Dilthey. And we'll go over the 4, and then I'll kind of condense those 4 more into 3 styles. But let's talk about the 4 that are in this chapter first. The first style mentioned is idealistic. You might know the phrase to say someone is idealistic or maybe too idealistic. That means they have too positive a sense of reality, or at least reality as they're going to be able to transform it. They're going to be able to make an impact and change the world. To back up, Tillich does say that all of these styles, any artistic style, can express or reveal an ultimate concern, that divine depth dimension, that dimension of God. And what the idealistic mode tries to do is to express the potential perfection. Remember, we talked about essence as what God intended when God creates things. So the potential perfection. The next is a realistic style. And this style exposes the negativities of of real existence, of reality as it might be experienced when things aren't going all that well. As Tillich talks about it, he talks about the divine demonic judging background. Because of our demonic tendencies, our self-destructive tendencies, because we make something ultimate that isn't, God judges us. That's the realistic style. When it's working, it brings forth that kind of expression of ultimate concern. The third style is the subjective. We've already talked about subjective versus objective. In this context, subjective means the individual artist's encounter with reality, kind of what's original to the artist as a unique person. Tillich does note that Romanticism in the 19th century, the 1800s, tended to be very individualistic. Each individual is kind of is a microcosm of the creative potential of the whole universe. So it's kind of, Romanticism was all about the individual's creative possibilities. Romantic music was very emotional, very expressive, we might say. And we'll come back to that word in a little bit. And also, by the way, Impressionism also is mentioned by Tillich as an example of the subjective style, where the subjective style dominates. Finally, fourth is the objective style. This tries to imitate reality, to paint as realistic as possible a picture of that apple or that vase with flowers. Note, here we're talking about realistic in another sense, kind of the way things are, whereas the realistic is pointing to the way things are when they're negative. We're being realistic in not glossing over whatever is evil or destructive in a culture. And what Tillich says about the positive of this style, the way it can reveal the ultimate, the depth dimension, is that it can reveal God as the hidden background, the ultimate source of what is good and beautiful that we see or imitate in nature or in human culture. Now Tillich, and this is a fairly important note, Tillich does note that an actual artistic creation is not purely one of these. And he even talks about some other ones, but let's just worry for now and worry for your homework of just about these four. But he says one style dominates a particular artist, a particular artistic creation. Okay. Hopefully you're with me on these four keys. I happen to have written some articles on Tillich and art, and my judgment is that though Tillich can talk about four different styles at the start of this chapter, and in other of his lectures and articles on art, he can talk about different styles, so he mixes it up. But overall, my conclusion is that he really reduces all the different potential styles to three most basic styles. And the first one we might mention is idealism. This obviously just is a way to restate this idealistic style that he talks about, first of all, in this article. Now, we've talked about the positive, but Tillich says that in general, an idealistic style is not the most conducive, it's not the most likely to really express that divine depth dimension. Because what idealism does is it tends to romanticize. Remember, we talked about romanticism, but romanticize means to make something more perfect than it is, to idealize it, right? Even maybe idolize it. We make it more perfect than it is. And Tillich sees a real religious danger in that something that is finite, when we idealize it, we tend to just get stuck in the finite and maybe make that our ultimate concern and lose sight of the infinite, of God. Let's look on the other side. And the imitating or objective style kind of goes into a style that more generally Tillich talks about as naturalism. That's trying to capture things the way they are, not idealized, not especially focusing on the negative as in realism, but things as they are. And mostly we might say the positive, imitating what is beautiful about our natural life. But again, this is not the most conducive to expressing or revealing God. Why? Because the focus is directly on the finite as it is, and we're again liable to just get stuck in the finite and not be able to be lifted up or to get into the depths of the divine. Okay, well that leads us to the winner in terms of Tillich's preferred style. Tillich tells us that the artistic style that is most suited to expressing the divine, the depth dimension, is expressionism. We have the word depth dimension right there, or abbreviation of dimension there. Now there was a particular movement that started in Germany in the early 20th century called Expressionism with a capital E, a particular artistic movement. But Tillich is using Expressionism in a wider sense. He says that art and architecture, religious art, architecture, that were able to effectively express the divine, like maybe a Gothic cathedral did for folks in the Middle Ages, like a stained glass window, or a painting of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus did. Expressionism is able to get us in touch, or most likely to get us in touch with the divine, with the deepest values of life. Let me share a quote or a group of quotes, a few sentences here from page 74 of this chapter. The expressive element in a style implies a radical transformation of the ordinarily encountered reality by using elements of it in a way which does not exist in the ordinarily encountered reality. So when we just experience something in the ordinary way, or even in the extraordinary way of idealism, we're just kind of stuck there in ordinary reality. Till it goes on. Expressionism disrupts the naturally given appearance of things. Certainly they are united in the artistic form, but not in a way which the imitating, that is objective, naturalistic, or the idealistic, or in this case, even the realistic element would demand. That which is expressed is the dimension of depth in the encountered reality. The ground and abyss in which everything else is rooted. Now note I do have a bit of a line coming down from the subjective, because Tillich does say that in the expressive mode, we do have an original encounter, an individual encounter with reality, but one that expresses this depth dimension to others, to the viewers, the appreciators of the art. Whereas the subjective can kind of just be left more within an individual's own finite encounter with reality. It might not rise to that expressive level. Okay, a further note that I think is very important, and this comes more from my analysis of Tillich than a totally clear-cut expression by Tillich. In other words, Tillich doesn't come right out and say, at least not in this chapter anyway, that there are two forms of expressionism. But I think if we read closely and sometimes read between the lines in the many pieces by Tillich on art, he does definitely divide expressionism into a negative and a positive variety. The negative variety tends to have a lot in common with this realistic dimension when it works. A negative expressionism opens up the demonic, the destructive, the idolatrous, the sinful, the estranged dimensions of a culture, of a society. If there's a negative side, then there's also the positive form of expressionism, the positive style. And here, as Tillich said, and I quoted a few moments ago, the everyday appearance, the ordinary encounter is distorted in some ways. It's bent, it's not normal. He does sometimes talk about primitive art as being very expressive in this positive way, like some of these early statues, Neolithic statues of goddess or mother, earth mother. The fertility of the feminine is lifted up, and fertility becomes something more than just finite human fertility, and we have this depth expression with a positive expressionism, we might say, to use an example. Okay, well, I did promise I'd say something about this somewhat strange title, Protestantism and Artistic Style. Tillich begins with this sentence: Picasso's Guernica is a great Protestant painting. Why is this strange? Well, Picasso certainly was not Protestant. He was Spanish, though he lived most of his life in France, in Paris. So he was Catholic to the extent that he did follow the religion he was raised in, number one. And number two, there's nothing in this painting, in terms of the subject matter or content, what is depicted, that is religious directly, let alone Protestant. So it's nothing like Martin Luther or about the Protestant Reformation. No. As if you've been reading, if you started to read or been reading along as you have been listening to me, Guernica is a terrible scene of destruction. Picasso was a Cubist, and Cubism often takes ordinary objects and kind of breaks them up into basic elementary shapes. So you might have a guitar, for example, in some of Picasso's Cubist paintings, where you have a little bit of the guitar here in a square, a little bit over here in a rectangle, and so on. Well, Guernica is like that, but it's this whole town. What was the situation? Well, it was the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. And the elected government, the loyalist government, the Republican government, was fighting against revolutionaries who were fascists. And they were under General Francisco Franco, who eventually won this civil war and became the dictator of Spain for decades. But what Franco did was call on the Nazis in Germany and the fascists in Italy to bring bombers in. And they bombed this town of Guernica to smithereens. This town where basically it was not a military installation. The people that were left in the town were old men, women, and children, and cattle and other animals. And it was just utterly destroyed. And we'll get a chance to look at Guernica as we move along in the history of Western art. But anyway, as Tillich says, this painting expresses the demonic, the destructive nature of of humanity, of our estrangement, in a very profound way. He first of all says the Protestant principle emphasizes the infinite distance between God and humanity. The Protestant principle always judges, or when it's working, it even judges the church, because the church as a human institution always needs to be judging itself, reforming itself, correcting itself. And then he goes on to talk a little bit about this incident at Guernica that we've already talked about. And then he says at the bottom of 68, onto the top of 69, its negative Protestant character is obvious. This negative, realistic, negative, expressionistic judgment upon the cruelty of humankind. The question of man in a world of guilt, anxiety, and despair is put before us with tremendous power. But it is not the subject matter itself. The willful and brutal destruction of a small town by fascist airplanes, which gives the picture its expressive force. Rather, it is that expressivistic stock, in this case, a negative expressionism. Let me have a word about architecture, and more generally, not just architecture in general, but religious architecture and religious art. And this touches on this difference between negative and positive forms of an expressionistic style. Tillich does say on page 74 toward the bottom, the rediscovery of the expressive element in art since about 1900 is a decisive event for the relation of religion and the visual arts. It has made religious art again possible. That is, directly religious art, maybe a picture of Jesus on the cross again, whereas Guernica clearly is not directly religious art, even though, ironically, Tillich calls it the greatest Protestant, or a great Protestant painting, maybe the greatest that he ever witnessed. Tillich goes on in the following paragraph, this does not mean that we already have a great religious art. We do not have it, either in terms of general religious art, nor in terms of artistic creation suitable for devotional purposes. But here's where we bring in architecture. An exception to this judgment is recent church architecture, in which a new beginning has been made, permitting high expectations for future development. Architecture is the most basic expression, just because it is not only art, but because it serves a practical purpose. He concludes that paragraph, writing, it is quite probable that the renewal of religious art will start in cooperation with architecture. Let me say a little bit more about that. It's kind of, and I'll develop this more in a second, but he's saying that when it comes to a positive expressionism in religious art, where there's a religious subject, it's kind of difficult to make it work, to really help us in an honest way encounter the divine depth dimension in a positive, creative way that just rings true to our culture today. But he says architecture is different. It's kind of by indirection, because you're building a church, for example, not so much as to directly give a message, but because it has a utilitarian or practical purpose. And so kind of from the unconscious, these less conscious dimensions of the human spirit, some positive expressionism might come forth. Okay, now to say a little bit more, I'm going to get back to Tillich. He continues, if we look at painting and sculpture, we find that under the predominance of the expressive style of the last 50 years, the attempts to recreate religious art have led mostly to a rediscovery of symbols in which the negativity of man's predicament is expressed. The symbol of the cross has become the subject matter of many works of art, often in the style which is represented by Picasso's Guernica. And Tillich believes some of those paintings that negative expressionism have really worked, like Guernica worked, but in this case, actual paintings of Jesus with a crown of thorns on his head, for example, and we'll see that later on in the course. Those have worked, but what about positive expressionistic religious art? Symbols such as resurrection have not yet found any adequate artistic representation. And so it is with other traditional symbols of glory. This is the Protestant element in the present situation. No premature solution should be tried. Rather, the human situation in its conflicts should be expressed courageously. Last paragraph. The predominance of the religious style in contemporary art is a chance for the rebirth of religious art. The only thing we can do is to keep ourselves open for a new rise of religious art through the expressive style in the art of today. The end.